I kind of put together a hodgepodge of a lot of different evidence to try and make a case for eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. Um, a lot of critical scholars they debate this claim. They want to say that the writers are too far removed from the events. I've even heard people say that uh, these are removed enough to be, three generations from the eyewitnesses. Uh, but this kind of evidence I'm going to present here, some of it's not very controversial. Um, Others, like undesigned coincidences, it's just not that well known. So critical scholars don't really respond to it very often. And that's why it's really good for us to learn, because no matter who you're talking to, whether it's somebody who doesn't really know anything about Christianity or it's someone who's a critical scholar, they're going to have a tough time figuring out how to explain away that kind of evidence. Um, there we go. Okay, so before I get into the first undesigned coincidence, let me just briefly explain what that was again. What an undesigned coincidence is when you have two different little details in one gospel and a different gospel, and they are kind of mentioned in a really offhanded manner that aren't really related to something in another gospel, but they actually work together like a puzzle. They fit together and they explain the overall story better. And the amazing thing about undesigned coincidences is that they show that these authors had independent knowledge of something, and they're they actually fit each other's stories, which makes them more likely to be true. So when we're using undesigned coincidences, we're making a cumulative case, meaning that we're adding all these pieces together, and it actually makes a really strong case once we've given quite a few of them. Um, so the first one comes from the feeding of the 5,000. That's the only pre-resurrection miracle recorded in all four Gospels. Um, and it starts in Mark. So then the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come with me privately to an isolated place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and there was no time to eat." So this last part is a little bit strange. It's hard to think, what is Mark referring to here, the many coming and going. You could say, well, maybe it's just the crowd following Jesus, but that seems odd because this is right before he's about to perform the miracle and they're, going to feed the people around him. It doesn't really account for why people are going. And so we have to figure out why would Mark add this detail? It seems totally unexplained. Now, when we go to John's gospel, we get the explanation for this. So John says about the feeding of the 5,000, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. So, John tells us that this happened at the time of the Passover. Well, this makes sense of Mark's account because during Passover, the Jews would travel back to Jerusalem, so you could account for all of this coming and going. They were going to see the temple and leaving. And we actually know this from other data from the first century Jewish historian Josephus. He gives evidence, an independent account from the Gospels of Jews doing this. So we have a perfect explanation of the coming and going in Mark's Gospel. But there's actually more to this undesigned coincidence. Um, and if you don't read the other Gospels, you're very likely to miss this little detail Mark adds in here. Um, Mark, Matthew, and John all mention the grass, but only Mark mentions about the feeding of the 5,000 that the grass was green. Um, and he doesn't explain it. He doesn't give any details that this is happening at the time of the Passover at all. It's just a little subtle thing that there was green grass. But we know from John's gospel that it was at the time of the Passover. The Passover happened in the springtime after the rainy months in this area in Palestine. That's when the grass would have been green. So let's think about this. We've had the coming and going explained by the Passover, as well as the detail mentioned in Mark about green grass. Now, imagine the gospel writers somehow getting all this information together and putting in these random details to make their accounts sound truthful. That just seems really implausible. The best explanation is that they're being truthful about the event that happened here. And notice how this is also for a miracle that we have these undesigned coincidences. It gives the feeding of the 5,000 actually historical strength. And here's one about Jesus' pre-existence. So this comes from John's prologue, which is from John 1:1 to John 1:18. I'm sure a lot of you probably have the beginning of that memorized. But it says, "Now the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We saw his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. John testified about him and shouted out, 'This one was the one about whom I said, he who comes after me is greater than I am, because he existed before me.'" So what is John talking about here, John the Baptist? Why does he say he who comes after me is greater than I am? Because he existed before me. The existed before me seems to point to Jesus' pre-existence, but we don't have the first part of this, that he comes after John the Baptist. We don't have that explained in John. Now, when you go to Luke's gospel, he gives us a full account of the birth narrative of Jesus. And he mentions specifically that in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, remember that Elizabeth was John the Baptist's mother, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, a descendant of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. So Luke gives us this detail that Elizabeth's been pregnant already for 6 months before Mary was pregnant with Jesus. So now we have evidence, or we have at least information that makes sense of John the Baptist's claim in John's gospel about one who comes after him. And then it makes even more clear the fact that he's claiming that Jesus is pre-existent when he says that he was before him. So it's very easy to miss these little details because we're so used to reading the birth narratives in one account and something else in another gospel, but these actually fit together really well. Okay, now here's an interesting one. And notice a lot of these are between John and the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are just the ones that are not John. And that's important that we recognize that these are between John and the Synoptics, because a lot of scholars like to paint a dichotomy between these two things. They say that John's Jesus is totally different than the one in the Synoptics. Well, we're giving evidence to the contrary because these accounts fit together super well. So this one comes from, it's about the Last Supper. And this scene in John happens early in Jesus' ministry, and it's totally unexplained. Jesus said to them, "I tell you that unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. The one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. The one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood resides in me, and I in him." Now, this scene, when Jesus is talking to the disciples and the others who are present, they seem very confused and offended by Jesus' statement here. John doesn't give any explanation of what Jesus means by this. He just leaves it there as being sort of bewildering to the people surrounding him. Now, it looks to us like it must refer to communion, and I would say that's probably the best interpretation of this passage that refers to communion. And let's see what the other Gospels, how they make sense of this passage. So Luke, and his reporting of the Last Supper, he says, then he took the bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten it, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." John is explaining these examples that Luke is explaining these examples of what John gives in his gospel, that Jesus' body refers to the bread of life, and that the cup refers to his blood. So we have a perfect explanation given in Luke that works with John's gospel. However, John actually doesn't mention any of the information in Luke's gospel about the Last Supper. He talks about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, but he doesn't mention this specific reference given in Luke. So these things don't look like they're, working together or copying from one another. They're very kind of random and in different places in their gospels. This one's really interesting. I really like this. So why does Jesus ask if Peter loves him more than these? So when they had finished breakfast, this is after Jesus has already risen, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." And then he said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything, and you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." So these refers to the disciples, probably. I don't think Jesus is looking around at the fish or the boat and saying, "Do you love me more than these?" That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Jesus is asking Peter, "Why do you love me more than the other disciples?" But this seems contrary to what Jesus teaches in Gospels, because Jesus tells them not to compete with one another. He says the least among you is the greatest, right? So why would Jesus want to make this comparison? And in John's Gospel, he never actually mentions Peter comparing himself with any of the other disciples. But we know from other Gospels, Matthew, that there are times when Peter does compare himself. And this is right before Jesus' execution on the cross. Then Jesus said to them, "This night you will all fall away because of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter said to him, "If they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." So it's typical of Peter, right? He kind of goes to the most extreme lengths. But notice here how he's basically saying that he loves Jesus more than any of the other disciples. Even if they all fail to follow Jesus, he will never leave Jesus. And we know that he does. But this actually makes sense of Jesus asking Peter if he loves him more than the other disciples, because Peter made this comparison. And notice how Jesus says, "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." This is a very interesting reference to this scene where he says, "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." The sheep of the flock refers to the disciples. So these things fit together really well between Matthew and Mark. Now, this is a really subtle design coincidence. It would be so odd if one gospel writer took this from another gospel and put it in his. But notice how Matthew lists his list of the disciples, of the 12 disciples. Notice how he groups them. The names of the 12 apostles are these: first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother; James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother; Philip and Bartholomew; Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector; James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus; Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Matthew is grouping these in twos always. And Matthew doesn't give any explanation for why he does that. But we know from Mark's gospel that he says that Jesus sent out the 12 and two by two. So that would make sense of Matthew's gospel that he's listing the 12 disciples in sets of two because Jesus sent them out in sets of two. Now, at first glance, this, just thinking about it, I mean, how would Matthew have possibly written this in a way to fit with Mark's gospel? It's so kind of random. It doesn't look anything similar to what's reported in Mark's gospel. And actually, Mark doesn't give us any details about the sending of, or sorry, Mark doesn't actually list his group in sets of twos like Matthew does. And Luke, he doesn't mention the sending out the 12 disciples. He mentions the sending out of the 70 in pairs. Only Mark's gospel mentions the 12 being sent out in pairs. So we can see that none of the gospels are really stealing this information from each other. They're all kind of reporting what they think is true, and it fits together. It gives evidence that what they're saying is truth. Now we're going to get into some of my favorite evidence, and that's from geography within the Gospels. I'm largely depending on scholar Peter J. Williams for this. He works at the Tyndale House, and which is at Cambridge. He's a great scholar, and you should pick up his book, Why Trust the Gospels. It's really, really good, and it's very short. It's an easy read. But here's what Peter Williams notes about the geography mentioned in the Gospels. All four Gospels know that traveling to Jerusalem, which is at an elevation of 750 meters, is correctly described as going up. Mark and Luke know that leaving Jerusalem is correctly described as going down. Now, this is important because someone writing far away from from Palestine, or after 70 AD, when the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem, it would be much more difficult for them to get this information or to know it. But the gospel authors get their geography right, where we can test them. And there's other examples. In Luke's recording of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus says that a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road. Well, Jericho is the lowest city on earth. I think it would be about a 1 kilometer down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So Luke's mention of this, of Jesus saying this parable, makes perfect sense of the geography of that time. Further examples, John 2:12 talks about going down from Cana to Capernaum, and John 4 mentions an official asking Jesus to come down from Cana to Capernaum to heal his son. And we don't know exactly where Cana is, but the lowest possible candidate for Cana is Khirbet Kana, which has an elevation of 200 meters, and Capernaum is at 200 meters below sea level. So even the lowest candidate for Cana would be higher than Capernaum, and so it makes sense of what John's saying. He gets his geography accurate here. Now this is really interesting. Luke, he puts these cities in a set of three. You may know this is the woes passage where Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Woe to you, Capernaum!" And Luke puts these in sets of three, which is very interesting because they actually are directly located near each other. And Chorazin was such a small town that for anyone to have any knowledge of it who wasn't in the area or knew someone from that area would be very difficult. And Peter J. Williams says, as far as we know, there was not a single literary source that could have provided this information to a gospel author. This is a really cool one. I got this from Tim McGrew, Lydia's husband. And if you want to see it, you can just go on YouTube, and it's there. On Lydia's YouTube channel, she has playlists, and there's a series of undesigned coincidence there that you can watch. But Oftentimes people will say Mark made some kind of geographical error because he doesn't mention the most direct route for Jesus to travel. This is what Mark says. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the Decapolis. The Decapolis was just a group of 10 cities. Um, I'll show you the map of this. So it's a little bit difficult to see. But you see, Mark is saying that he's heading to the Decapolis from Tyre, right? So that would be a direct line here, but he says by way of Sidon. So if you look at that, that would mean Mark is saying that they traveled up here to Sidon and then down to the Decapolis. But why would he do that? The most direct route is just a straight line to Decapolis. So those skeptics will say, okay, Mark clearly doesn't know about the Palestinian geography because going to Sidon would be way out of their way. Well, if you look here, there's a mountain in between. There's a large mountain, and it would have been very difficult to travel over that on foot. It would have taken a lot more time. But uh, the way Mark puts it, if they travel to Sidon, they get out of the way of the mountain and they can go along the river all the way down to the Decapolis for smooth, safe travels. So Mark actually knows what he's talking about here. So here's some other evidence. In Mark and Matthew's gospel, instead of naming the Sea of Galilee using the formal title Sea of Galilee, Mark and Matthew just refer to it as the sea. Imagine if you're a local there in Palestine, you wouldn't say every time, oh, the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. You would just comment the sea. Mark and Matthew use the full title only sometimes when they're traveling from some other area back towards the Sea of Galilee. But in general, they just refer to it as the sea. This is exactly what we would expect of people who lived and were part of Jesus' ministry. They wouldn't use these full titles in referring to it. Now you could say, okay, well, I think they're using the sea to make their account appeal authentic, but that seems really strange. The simplest explanation would just be that they were locals. They just knew the land and they referred to it how locals would refer to it. And now this is really cool. Luke does not refer to Galilee as a sea at all, but he calls it a lake. Now, we know from early church fathers that Luke was supposedly the author of Luke's gospel. He was a traveling companion of Paul, and he was from Antioch, which was near the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the Mediterranean Sea is way bigger than the Sea of Galilee. So if Luke really was from this area, the Sea of Galilee would not have been a sea to him compared to the Mediterranean. So the word lake actually makes a lot more sense if Luke really was from where the church fathers say he was from. So here's some evidence from the naming of plants in the Gospels. Jesus, he references tithing mint, dill, and cumin. And this is cool because it shows knowledge of the rabbinic debate, the rabbis debating on this topic of the time. We know this from the Mishnah, which is just a collection of rabbinic materials that they were debating these kinds of things. So Jesus' sayings fit perfectly within the time period of when these debates were happening. Now, this is also really amazing, but Luke records, we all know the story of Zacchaeus, right? And he climbed up the sycamore tree because he wanted to see Jesus. And then Jesus said he was going to be dining at his house, and he comes down. Well, Luke mentions this specific detail, the sycamore tree. Well, sycamore trees didn't grow in the northern Mediterranean at all. In fact, they didn't grow in everywhere in Palestine, but they were specifically characteristic of the city of Jericho. How would Luke have known that if he wasn't in touch with eyewitnesses or had been to the region himself? This would be such a strange and small detail. Imagine you move to, say, a new country somewhere, or even a new city. Imagine just trying to get acquainted with that city. It'd be very hard for you to get those kinds of details right just from even visiting a city. you would really need to do solid investigation or be from there to know these types of things. Now, here's some evidence from finance. Uh, Matthew and Mark, they mention a group of tax collectors in Capernaum. And Peter J. Williams, he says Capernaum was at a strategic point at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee and a key location for collecting customs on what crossed the border of the territory of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is just the successor of, or the son of Herod the Great. But anyways, so Mark and Matthew are mentioning a group of tax collectors exactly where we would expect them to be, because Capernaum was an ideal location. More evidence that their story makes a whole lot of sense. And they mention it kind of in an indirect way. They're not, they don't show signs that they're really desperately trying to make this appear true. They're just casually mentioning a group of tax collectors in Capernaum. Now, this is evidence that you've probably never heard of or even thought would be evidence before. And this argument was formulated by New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I definitely recommend reading that book, although it's quite heavy if you're just new to gospel studies. But anyways, his argument is basically that he took all the data of names he could find in Palestine. He did this from things like ossuaries, which were like the bone boxes for the deceased, or tombs, empty tombs, or inscriptions, or other documents from people in Palestine. And he compared them to the names that we see in the New Testament. And the idea is, if the New Testament's accurate, then it should have names that would be there and would appear in around the same amount in the Gospels as it did in the whole of Palestine. So here's Richard Bauckham's comparison. For the name Simon, which was the most popular name, there's 248 occurrences total and 8 in the New Testament alone. And Joseph, which is the second most common, there's 218 total occurrences, and then 6 in the New Testament. So if you look down, these numbers seem like, okay, all those most popular names, they appear in the New Testament, so it seems like they're using names that would have been in Palestine. But let's look at the percentages of those names used in the New Testament versus the percentages in Palestine. So the most popular names, Simon and Joseph, appeared about 15.6% in all of the Palestinian names. And then the Gospels and Acts was about 18.2%. And then men with the 9 most popular names appears 41.5% in Palestine and 40.3% in the Gospel and Acts. Women with the most popular names, Mary and Salome, 28.6% in Palestine, and then 38.9% in the Gospel and Acts. And women with the 9 most popular names, 49.7% in Palestine and 61.1% in the Gospel and Acts. So these are roughly close. It'd be very hard for someone to be looking back at the events and just get these names that happen to fit so well in Palestine. They wouldn't be able to know these kinds of things if they were from outside the area of Palestine. So it's really good evidence that they were getting these names correct. And we have people who were at least maybe secondhand to eyewitnesses or eyewitnesses themselves. But we can, if we look at outside of Palestine, just to compare, we can see what the names in other areas were compared to that in Palestine. So in Egypt, for example, there was many Jews in Egypt still in this time. So the name Eliezer or Lazarus was first in Egypt and third in Palestine. And this one is a pretty big difference. Sabbatius was second in Egypt and 68th in Palestine. There's other big differences too with Pappus is 4 in Egypt, and 39 in Palestine. Ptolemaeus is 6th in Egypt and 50th in Palestine. So we're saying there's a difference in names between Egypt and Palestine. So these writers would have had to get their information from Palestine to get these names correct. It would be so difficult for them to have a way of getting their names, Palestinian names, correct if they weren't from there themselves. So we can actually take this argument even further. So we can look at the way names are listed in the Gospels. And frequently, the most common names, like Simon, they're disambiguated, meaning that they give an extra title to clarify which Simon they're talking about. So in Mark's Gospel, we have Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Leper, Simon the Cyrenian. Simon was the most popular name in Palestine, so it makes perfect sense that these writers are giving these extra titles to distinguish between which Simon that they're talking about. But we have an even better example in Matthew. Now, if you notice these little numbers next to the names, that's the number of the popularity of that name in Palestine. So here's Matthew's list. First, Simon, which is the first most popular name, who is called Peter. He gives another title to Simon to distinguish which Simon it is. And Andrew, a not so common name, his brother. Philip, a not so common name, and Bartholomew. Notice how Matthew doesn't add any further title to say which Philip or with which Bartholomew, because they're not common names. Thomas, no clarifier there. And Matthew, the tax collector. Matthew is a common name, so Matthew's giving a way to disambiguate that name. James, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, not a common name. Simon the Zealot. And Judas Iscariot. Judas was also a very common name. So the gospel writers, they actually show that they know which names were popular and which were not. They didn't have these collections of names like we would have today. So for them to be able to get something like this right is so implausible unless they were there and present and knew these people themselves. Okay, now we're on to the last section, so hang in there. And this is oftentimes disregarded by critical scholars. They want to push all of the early church testimony away, or maybe they pick and choose. Okay, I like what Eusebius says, but I don't think Papias's comment is relevant. They'll do those kinds of things all the time. But I'm just going to show you generally what the early church thought about the identity of the gospel authors. So one of the most clear references to this comes from Irenaeus, who I think was the bishop of Lyon in 185 AD. So roughly 150 years after Jesus died. And he says, Matthew, a tax collector for Capernaum, was one of the 12 disciples, also called apostles. Mark, not one of the 12, was the apostle Peter's interpreter in Rome, generally identified as John Mark, whose mother Mary had a property in Jerusalem. He was a cousin of Barnabas, who originated from Cyprus. Luke, not one of the 12, was a medical doctor who accompanied Paul on some of his travels around the Mediterranean and was the only New Testament writer who may have been a Gentile. And then lastly, John, son of Zebedee, was one of the 12, the younger brother of James and a fisherman from Capernaum. So here we have Irenaeus clearly identifying the gospel writers as the ones that you see on your New Testament today. Now, one of the earliest references we have is from Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, and he very likely knew some of the disciples themselves, or at least acquaintances with the disciples. I believe he knew possibly Philip's daughter, if you know the disciple Philip. And we know that from other early church fathers' writings. But Papias is writing somewhere between 110, I've seen as early dates as 110, as late as 140, about Mark's gospel. And he says, and the presbyter used to say this, or in some translations, it will be the elder. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him, but later on, as I said, followed Peter. Um, you may look at this and think, okay, this is a bit strange. Like, why does he say that not in order? Mark never followed the Lord. Well, a lot of people think that Mark's gospel, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people. Some people think that Mark's gospel is not always written chronologically. He puts things in a sort of thematic way. So he's telling this story here and that story there. It doesn't mean that the information in Mark's gospel is not true. He's just putting it in a certain order. But the important thing, anyways, is that Peter is behind Mark's gospel. So we have eyewitness testimony there. And then Papias says also about Matthew. Matthew put the logia in an ordered arrangement in the Hebrew language, but each person interpreted them as best he could. So he's referring to Matthew, the disciple here, the tax collector. The logia probably refers to sayings or teachings, something like that. It's often debated in scholarship over just what one simple word means. Now, Matthew's gospel is not written in Hebrew. It's written in Greek. So some people will say that maybe the gospel writers used a source that was from Matthew, where he wrote in Hebrew originally, and they translated it into Greek. We don't really know much about Papias's comment here, and most of what Papias has been written, in fact, all of it has been lost except through other church fathers who quote him. So we can't know exactly what Papias thought about this. Now, here's just are all the citations for the Gospels and how the traditional authorship is mentioned. So aside from Papias and Irenaeus, we have the Muratorian fragment, which is I think it's the first reference to the canon. It's been dated to the 2nd century, but there's a push to date it as late as the 4th century. I don't think the arguments are convincing. Maybe we can ask Pastor Samuel in our next meeting on the canon. Then Tertullian, 3rd century church father, mentions that Mark was Peter's translator. Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, 2nd century. Origen, 3rd century. Traditional authorship for Matthew. Eusebius, who's 4th century. And he was a church historian, is largely responsible for our modern New Testament canon. Tertullian, 3rd century Origen, and Jerome. Luke's gospel has actually maybe even better evidence in some ways. So that there's a heretic, Marcion, in the 2nd century, who he sort of threw out much of the New Testament that he didn't like. The church fathers wrote speaking against his teachings. But anyways, he references Luke as being the author of the gospel, also Tertullian again. And then the oldest manuscript of Luke, P75, which dates maybe late 2nd century, early 3rd. This manuscript describes the book to Luke. And then lastly, John. And we have a lot of sources for John. We have a very early source from Theophilus of Antioch in 181 AD. We also have possible allusions to John being the author in Tatian. Tatian wrote the first harmony of the Gospels, of the 4 Gospels in the 2nd century. We have Claudius Apollinaris. I don't really know much about him. And then Athenagoras. And then also we have Polycarp, who was a 2nd century church father and a very important witness. So what does this tell us in general about the authors of the Gospels? Well, we don't see in the early church any other authors being ascribed to these documents. We just see the traditional names that we have today. It seems like with the case we've made from other reasons for them to be eyewitnesses, that the authors make perfect sense with the case we've made. Now, Richard Bauckham, whom I mentioned earlier, the writer of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he actually doesn't think John of Zebedee, one of the 12, was the author of John's Gospel. He makes an argument from Papias' statement, which I mentioned earlier, that John the Elder, who we don't know much about, was the writer of John, but he knew the disciples. Either way, I don't necessarily agree with Richard Bauckham here, but if you want to go that route, we still have eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels. So to sum it up, we have our evidence from undesigned coincidences that show that the Gospel authors, what they're writing, it fits together really well. And for them to have lied about it and somehow get their accounts to match so closely and in such a incidental and undesigned way is very unlikely. We have our topographical evidence from places and geography that the gospel authors are getting correct. They know the elevations, they know the directions, and generally how to navigate the land. Then we have our evidence from the names in the Gospels of Palestinian names that they also get correct. And we have the external, so outside of the New Testament, we have external evidence from the early church that the gospel writers either knew the eyewitnesses or they were eyewitnesses themselves. The simplest explanation to account for all this data is that the gospel sources stem from eyewitness testimony. If a skeptic wants to argue that it's not, they have to somehow explain away all the data that I've just given you. That's going to be very difficult for them to do. Now, if you want to get any further with this argument or any of these details I've given you, I'd recommend Peter J. Williams' Can We Trust the Gospels? It's only like 140 pages, and it's really well done. And by the way, Peter J. Williams is behind, I think, the ESV translation. He's a pretty major scholar. If you want more on undesigned coincidences, you can go to Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View. Also not very long book, very good book. It's the best defense of undesigned coincidences in modern day. And then also I told you about the playlists on our channel you can look at. If you just want to know general stuff about the New Testament and authorship of the Gospels, you can go to D.A. Carson and Moo's Introduction to the New Testament. And then once again, Jesus and Eyewitnesses. If you want a really thorough knockdown case for the reliability of the New Testament, you can read Craig Blomberg's book. He's a very good scholar. And it's a large book. I think it was something like 600 pages. But anyways, that's where you can go for more sources.